Morning. How's that? This is such a beautiful service. It's such a privilege to be a part of it. And I just want to start by thanking Chris and Linda and the Mackenzie Committee and my old friend Patty Limerick, old in the sense of we've known each other for a long time. It's been a really rich and interesting weekend, and I hope that it's just the start of a conversation. It's also really special to me to be here this morning for a couple of other reasons. I actually lived in Boulder for 3 years, about 30 years ago, so a long time ago. And also, the United Church of Christ, as I'm sure many of you know, was actually really instrumental in the foundation of the environmental justice movement in the late 70s and early 80s. I work mostly on environmental justice, and I know that as a result of that legacy that you now have a creation justice covenant, which it's been really interesting to hear about. Okay. Is this right? Okay. What can I do about climate change or about any environmental crisis? It's the question that environmentalists love to ask. 50 simple ways to save the Earth. 8 easy ways you can stop climate change. 101 ways you can help save the planet. Apparently, you can do a lot of things. Do you have a horse? There's a book called Eco-Horsekeeping that lists 100 budget-friendly ways that you and your horse can save the planet together. What can I do? It's a question that an ethical person asks, ideally, and it seems like an appropriate question to ask here in a church, or I would more often be in a shul or synagogue. What can I do? It's actually 4 questions, I think. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And what can I do? I'll come back to that. But whichever way, what can I do is a tricky question for me, as I've written a book in which I argue that no, there aren't 8 or 50 or 100 easy ways that you yourself can stop climate change, and that the obsession with what can I do, even if you do it with your horse, has allowed us to wildly overemphasize the impact of individual actions and wildly underemphasize the dire necessity of the big systemic changes we need to make. That it often comes with a greener-than-thou attitude that's profoundly alienating to so many people, that it too often seems to be more about trying to be a super virtuous person than about actually doing something effective, that why do you think you can solve a global crisis from your kitchen? As do Americans ask this question so consistently about the Middle East crisis, or about widespread child poverty, or about slave labor worldwide. That it's allowed Coke to perpetuate a 75-year recycling scam so that you can stop the growing plastics crisis, while the company now produces 3 million metric tons of new plastics each year, and it's encouraged BP to invent the popular idea of the carbon footprint, along with a handy carbon calculator, so you can measure how you're responsible for the floods and fires and the perilous future of lower Manhattan. That CNN's tweet in response to the terrifying IPCC climate report that you should take the bus, eat less meat, and buy a new thermostat, well, to say that these actions are extremely unlikely to stop the glaciers from melting is a great 21st century understatement. And that if everyone would just act virtuously and buy a smart thermostat approach tends to flatten, Swedish pancake flatten, the vast disparities in who actually creates and perpetuates the climate crisis, and tends to define the more affluent people who can afford to buy a Tesla or an expensive new thermostat as especially virtuous, while ignoring that these are the very people who actually use the most energy and contribute most to climate change, as compared to, for example, the folks in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, a heavily African-American 80-mile corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where the fossil fuel industry has built 150 and counting oil refineries, factories, and other petrochemical plants. What can I do is a tricky question for me, as I've argued very passionately for a very long time that if we want to save anything at all, then what can I do is an important question, but only when it doesn't actively prevent you from asking who is actually responsible and what actually needs to be done. And the most common response I have received is, yes, okay, but what can I do? What can I do? And I love that, that Chris actually put "What can you do?" as the title. That's the way she heard it, as you'll see. When I suggested this to Chris as a possible sermon topic, she said she liked it, and she assured me it would be appropriate, and we basically shook hands on it over Zoom. And then she said, and the sermon generally offers reflection on Scripture. Okay. So she hastened to add, you can use Jewish Scripture. Okay. It's at this point that I should probably tell you that I'm not exactly a Torah scholar. This, too, is a great 21st century understatement. I have a strong Jewish identity, but it's more of an I like brisket, I bake challah using my great-grandmother's recipe, I can sing the Dayenu song at the Passover Seder, well, the first verse, kind of Jewish identity. My favorite musical is Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. However, I had a good idea. I looked up the Torah, or the Old Testament, reading for this particular week. It's called the Parsha, which in Hebrew means portion. And in Judaism, as many of you know, we read the entire Torah every year, every Saturday or Shabbat, weekly Parsha by weekly Parsha, beginning anew each year on Rosh Hashanah. As it turns out, the Parsha for this particular week is called Tazria Metzora, which means skin disease. It's about leprosy, rashes, and growths. The details are graphic. It's the Parsha that Jewish 13-year-old bar and bat mitzvah kids who must read and interpret the Parsha for the week in which they were born love to hate. I won't take you there, mostly. However, fortunately for me, one of my brothers, Joe, is modern Orthodox and even lives in Israel, and he's a classic scholar to boot. And one of his sons, my wonderful nephew, Micha, is co-writing a book with the biblical scholar Diana Lipton on how the Bible can help us think about climate change. I'm his crazy writer environmentalist aunt, so he's been sending me manuscript drafts for feedback. As it happens, he was just about to send me a new chapter with the title Individual versus Collective. I think it's fascinating, and in a non-skin disease way. So with Micha and Diana's permission, I'd like to share a piece of it with you. Anyone who reads the book of Deuteronomy in a language, say English, that, unlike the Hebrew in which it is written and the King James English into which it is much later translated, does not distinguish between the plural and singular forms of the second person you, is missing an important dimension of the text. What is arguably most important above all is the constant shifting back and forth between you singular and you plural. We must be both. And I'll read my favorite part again of Diana and Micha's explanation. The constant shifting back and forth between the you singular and the you plural. And they cite passages from the Bible, in case you were wondering if I was going to do that. And they use a small lowercase y for singular, I'll represent it as one finger, and a big Y for plural, I'll do two fingers. Deuteronomy 8:1. This commandment that I command you today, you must diligently observe, so that you may live and increase. They also cite the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6 as a surpassing example of the relationship between individual and collective. Shema means hear, and the Shema is the centerpiece of a Jewish service, the most essential prayer, the prayer that confirms monotheism, and the prayer that I actually do know and can sing in Hebrew. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord is our God. You shall love the Lord your God. Cool, right? The Lord is our God. You shall love the Lord your God. What can I do? I find this explanation of the relationship between individual and collective helpful. Also in a skin disease way, as so much of this week's Parsha actually lays out a detailed set of rules for how individuals with growths and rashes should isolate for the sake of the collective. Perhaps this sounds familiar. But back to environmentalism, though, as this helps me articulate how I think we so often have tended to wrap our what can I do actions in a sense of superior individual virtue. Or to put it in another, and I'm sure familiar way, in a notorious greener than thou-ness. My Tesla is greener than your Prius. Well, that's nice for you, but I take the metro. Yeah, well, I ride one of my 7 bikes. Or basically, I'm saving the planet and you're not. Or here's a favorite. The headquarters campus for our global oil company is LEED Platinum certified. How about yours? We have the world's best air filter, rooftop solar panels, and 63 dedicated parking spaces for electric cars, and we offer organic, vegan, GMO-free acai berry smoothies at all our sustainable bamboo coffee carts. Green virtue is easy to mock. South Park once aired an episode, Smug Alert, in which a smug cloud threatens to engulf the Bay Area. The Onion has reported on a new Prius model designed to be the most environmentally friendly car ever. You turn it on and it kills you with its revolutionary new EcoSpike technology, and then it turns you into compost. There's a family model. The Lord is our God, you shall love the Lord your God. I find Micha and Diana's invocation of the Shema exceptionally helpful because they emphasize that the Torah tells us that you always act as part of you. And because I think too often in environmentalism, the singular you so often acts in triumphant opposition to the plural you, that too often we drive electric cars against the collective, as in, I drive a Tesla, I emit less than everyone else. That the goal has been more to achieve individual virtue instead of collective virtue, baked-in virtue, which renders virtuous individual acts the norm. Or sometimes it's even, I have 3 Teslas, so I emit 3 times less, which is, of course, really bad math. Or in my LEED certified oil company HQ, I breathe the world's cleanest air. In other words, some of these individual acts of virtue can even move the collective backwards. And really, what I want to ask here this morning is that I wonder if the individual virtue in the greener than thou approach requires an unvirtuous collective. It requires a collective in which public policies allow for dirty energy, in which public policies subsidize the creation of Cancer Alley and thousands of other sacrifice zones across the country. If it requires a collective in which public policies pass the buck to individuals who are then ostensibly free to make virtuous choices or not, to choose to stay healthy, or to buy green, or to recycle, choices that in fact require you to be affluent to make, usually. I wonder if the I drive a Tesla, how about you approach requires a collective that blames individuals for big systemic problems and that asks individuals to solve them and then applauds and rewards and subsidizes the individuals who are affluent enough to take these actions, which in fact actually add up to so little. The Lord is our God. You shall love the Lord your God. The constant shifting between the you singular and the you plural. I love Diana and Micha's explanation because I think it helps us ask whether the greenie obsession with what can I do is encouraging a collective failure to ask, what can we do? I think it tells us that the truly urgent and important question isn't, how can I be a virtuous person, but how can we be more virtuous? How can you and I work for a collective in which ethical choices are the norm, so much so that we don't even think about them? Can we work for, dream, envision a collective in which a triumphant post on Twitter that I just bought a 7th bike would be utterly ridiculous? Can we dream that we, as a society, will actually stop climate change? How will we do that? And this, at last, brings me back to the 4 what can I do questions. And Passover, Pesach, is just around the corner, so I might even think of these as an homage to the 4 questions near the start of the Seder, the Passover meal, that the youngest child asks. I'm the youngest child, I ask them often as a child, about the meaning of Pesach. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And what can I do? And here, I will tell you up front, if I am allowed to play favorites, that my own take is that what and do are a lot more helpful than can and I. What can I do? Well, yes, I use energy-efficient light bulbs, and I eat as organic as I can, and my car, well, I'm not going to get into comparing my car to your car. If you can afford to do these things, they're not usually bad things to do, and they can indeed be ethical acts. I've just come to believe that they're ethical, especially if I don't tell myself that I personally am beating back climate change, that I'm refreezing the glaciers, or that I personally am reforming the food system while I do them, since, I'm really not. And yet, the Lord is our God, you shall love the Lord your God. How might you act to reform the food system? You can act collectively to make social change. If you have a garden, wunderbar. No need to do more, yum. But if you want to change our broken food system, you can band together with your neighbors to make it easy for all to grow local organic produce. You can share tools and knowledge and labor, and you can set aside land for community gardens for folks who don't have yards with sun or yards at all. Just add chickens, ducks, goats, guinea fowl. You can create a food sharing depot, a tool library, a compost corner, and how about pickle and jam making dance parties? The Lord is our God. You shall love the Lord your God. You can act collectively to make systemic change. Wouldn't it be nice, for example, to enact the sorts of food policies that Boston now pursues, with an Office of Urban Agriculture and an Office of Food Justice, and to make public land available for urban farms, food forests, and community gardens, and to limit the power of chains and the ag lobby to profit by producing and selling toxic foods as cheaply as possible, and to make sure that everyone, no matter your income, has abundant access to healthy food. What can I do? What can I do? These middle questions, I'll confess again, are not my favorites. What can I do seems like the most one-fingered of the four questions, unless it's followed with, if I'm Joe Biden. And what can I do calls up again some very bad math that environmentalists have tended to engage in for decades, which is you can do anything, any little bit, anything you can do, and it'll all add up. But ultimately, it hasn't added up for the climate or groundwater pollution or species extinction or the plastics apocalypse. And to just do anything, any little bit, anywhere is clearly not ever going to add up, even if you're Joe Biden. And I'm sure many of you have read the news about the new IPCC climate report, and I've read about the shocking fires in this community where I used to live. And do we really have time to keep asking, what can I do and what can I do, instead of what needs to be done? What should we do? And finally, there's what can I do? And I'm going to end my sermon and my first ever reflection on Scripture with, what can I do? As to me, this last question sounds like a plea, almost a plea to the heavens. The Lord is our God. You shall love the Lord your God. What can I do? To me, this says something like, Lord, what can I do? I know my power to change the world is limited, but I am terrified. I am desperate. I love so many young people in this world, and I love so much in this world, and I am seeing a future that I have no words to describe. What can I do? This, I think, is a humble question, a pure-hearted cry, a plea to something larger than yourself. And to that question, we can say, you can do something, and we can do so much. Thank you. This is a first for me, and it's been a real privilege.